Welcome to All Rise. It's Abdu Murray.
That's me.
Again, it's me, your host, Derek Caldwell, researcher, all that.
Mhm.
And today, this is a very special episode, not just because of our guest, but it might be, depending on when we put it out, episode number 100. Not to put our guest on. I know, I'm surprising you too.
Yeah.
Um, but, uh, um, but most of the time when you have like a milestone episode like that, it's sort of like you look to the past and whatever. But
Mhm.
this episode, we're looking to the future.
That's us.
That's us.
We're progressive in that way.
Yeah, yeah, careful. Careful, careful.
No, in that way.
Yeah,
Wait,
um,
and now she's gone.
yeah, in the way time
Yes,
to the
the way
future,
time
yes.
progresses, that indeed,
Um,
indeed.
but, uh so we're gonna be talking about some things today that shows the progress
Mhm,
of science in some realms that
mhm.
is actually against the progressivism that's been taking place.
Yeah.
But also towards, we do have a great guest today who, is I've been familiar with for a couple of years, doing great work
Mhm.
online and a very interesting story. So I just wanted to invite Sabrina Joy Stevens from uh, of Leaving Groupthink Inc. and Swordplay on Substack. She's been featured in the Boston Globe and Time Magazine, all sorts of stuff. Sabrina, welcome to All Rise.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so as I said, I've been became aware of you a couple years ago. It's been one of the great things about Substack is you find all these sort of independent people that are going to be existing outside of normal spaces that maybe don't always allow independent people to exist. This is the
Mm.
the platform that the Free Press went on, Barry Weiss's Free Press, and so it sort of is a lot of people like that.
Mhm.
And Sabrina, you are one of these people who very interestingly was in that progressive space, which you refer to as Groupthink Inc. and and then came out of that. So I wanted to start off just getting to know you a bit too and your journey through that because it's um, really interesting, and sometimes it is difficult when you meet people in that space and see how sort of ideologically captured they are.
Mhm.
You sort of think there's literally no hope for this person. Um,
Yeah. And I would just gonna preface this because I might bring it in at the end of our conversation, is that both Derek and I come from backgrounds that are very different from the backgrounds we currently have.
Yeah.
Is Derek was an atheist, and he's not an
Right.
atheist anymore, and I was a Muslim, and I'm not a Muslim anymore. So you're our kind of people. So
Yeah.
very interested in your story and how that whole thing emerged. So yeah, fill us in.
yeah, specifically, did you grow up with any kind of Christian? I know you're a Christian now. Did you grow up with a Christian background? Did you grow up in a very politically progressive family? What created that earlier version of Sabrina?
Yeah, so I think definitely did not grow up with a identifiably Christian background. My parents are theistic, so they believe that there is a God, that it is a unitary God, but we're not necessarily discernibly Christian. Aside from kind of the way that many, especially in Black communities, cult like you sort of a nominal or cultural Christianity is sort of one of the through lines, but I think probably and this is, I think, probably the basis of some of my interest in ideology and ideological capture. Really, really, we're just kind of in the cultural wind. So I'm, an 80s, 90s baby. And so kind of came of age right as we're kind of starting to enter that cultural time when the culture really is like very full force moving away from Christianity.
Right.
And I grew up in New Jersey. I was born in New York, grew up in New Jersey. So very much kind of steeped in sort of the just kind of generally nice, politically correct, sort of the precursor to what we now identify as, you could say progressive, you could say woke, depending on, where you're coming from. But so, and basically that's kind of the sort of cultural soup I was coming up in. It's not necessarily, you know, identifiably Christian, does not have that sense of what is the gospel, anything like that, but just kind of, be nice to people,
Right.
work hard in school, do the right thing in terms of accomplishment, and the rest should work out for itself. And so that's really how I was raised. And so for me, because, now, of course, now I have sort of a bigger picture understanding of the different uh, people, ideologies, et cetera, that were working to capture a lot of the institutions, the cultural institutions, the educational institutions that I came through. But at the time, I had no, I was just a good student. So I'm like, whatever it takes to be successful in this environment, I'm going to pick it up and do it really well. And so that's really where I was coming from. So went through a very blue public school system, came out of that, went to a Quaker founded college, very much, very progressive, politically progressive sort of place. And so that's really where I was coming from. This was just the overwhelmingly dominant cultural political viewpoint that I was, raised in. Did a lot of activism, and so was very much, that was the social environment, that was the educational environment. And to the extent that I was ever exposed to anything having to do with any other viewpoint, it was mostly to disparage it, right? These are either our political opponents in the culture, the like actual devoted Christians are kind of the butt of jokes. They were, that's sort of when I was coming up, is being surrounded by people and ideas that are very much either just sort of indifferent to the God of the Bible and and the idea that the word of God is in any way authoritative, or to the extent that they have a perspective on it, they're actively hostile to it.
Mhm.
And so that's really where I was coming from. And so I very much was right in that same stream. And so I've never been someone who was an atheist. I had that same, just kind of like my parents had that theistic worldview. There's something beyond me. There's something beyond us. But there could be a lot of different ways to identify and relate to that higher power, whatever it might be.
Mhm.
And so that's really how I grew up.
Yeah, and it sounds like, you know, part of that it might align with something that's referred to as like this sort of American, moral therapeutic deism, sort of
Mhm.
be nice, it's good for you, be
Mm,
nice to other
mhm.
people. But it sounds like then what, you know, someone like that, like you, and I could put myself in that same milieu, 80s, 90s. Um, you
I wish I could.
in
I
the
can't. It's
70s, 80s,
70s, 80s. Yeah,
I know. You saw the original Star Wars when it came out.
I did.
It's
Okay.
but going in then into a college setting, like you have these good impulses to want to care for people. And that but without that framework, you become very sort of ripe for the picking for certain types of
Oh,
sort
yeah.
of ideologies. And so your entrance into the groupthink world, um, I believe it starts in college. You already mentioned political
Yeah.
activism.
And I think,
Yeah.
right. And I think for me too, like, I think the seeds were kind of laid from the very beginning, but certainly going into college, I think part of what is really risky about this way of kind of just be nice to people, sort of I think moral therapeutic deism is like a good way of thinking. There is this default assumption, right, which is very high contrast to what we learn in scripture, which is this like default assumption that everybody's good, right? That human beings are innately good, as opposed to just having we are image bearers, and so there is that aspect of God that is still imprinted on us. But this idea that everyone's kind of good, it causes you not to be skeptical of yourself in ways that you probably should. I think for me, looking back, I can see how I was really, as you said, ripe for the picking, because on the one hand, I did have those impulses of I wanted to be like the heroes in my history books. I wanted to do the right thing, and I wanted to, make the world a more just place. But I was also still very much a sinner, right? I get into college, and like most of the people around me, I'm partying. So I'm engaging in sexual sin. I'm engaging in, drinking, all this other kind of stuff. And so that party lifestyle, on the one hand, there's tiny little part of my conscience who's getting just, absolutely drowned in liquor and whatever else every weekend. Because there is that part of us, right, that knows, wait a minute, we have that moral thing written into us because we are, again, made in God's image. But because there's this like messaging around of just like, no, whatever you want to do is fine as long as you're not hurting anybody. And it's like, let's talk about what it means to hurt anybody, but okay.
Right.
Um, And so I think there's a really attractive way in which the progressive worldview basically says that you are a good person as long as you have the right politics. So as long as you're voting for the right candidates, as long as you support the right causes, as long as you are performing the right political rituals, all this other stuff that you do that might be very destructive to yourself and others is all okay as long as you're falling in line on the things that they care about that day. Because that's the other thing that I came to realize over time is that it shifts and it's constantly shifting under your feet because it is that sinking sand of relativism, right? It's,
Yeah.
how does it make people feel? How do, and so I was very much right for that because that enabled me to not have to, listen to any cultural voices or even my own conscience with witnessing against me that like, no, actually, there's some serious problems with how you're acting. There's some serious problems with how you're conducting your life. And so I think that that definitely, so I kind of got into that worldview because that's what the majority of my professors were pushing,
Yeah.
and because it harmonizes sort of that desire to want to be able to do bad things without having to feel like a bad person, which I think is like the, sort of one of the central tensions being made in God's image, but having that sin nature, right? Is that we actually know that we aspire to goodness in many cases, even as we also really want to do things that are not good. And so then coming out of college, I, taught for a little while in public as a public school teacher because that seemed like a way to do activism every day is like help shape the next generation to, do activism basically in a democracy. But that ended up going poorly. I was, pretty well regarded teacher, really loved my students, but the school situation was really crazy. So I came out, I graduated and went into school teaching just as No Child Left Behind became like really went into effect. And so that's when like sort of this super hyper testing culture was really um kicked into full force, and so I wanted to because I had like, sort of I wanna be that good teacher with the cape on, right? Like, so many of us grew up watching Dangerous Minds. You probably remember Michelle
Yeah.
Pfeiffer and loved all
Oh,
these,
yeah.
like, that
Yeah.
one good teacher in the failing school movie, like, I feel like that is like
Yeah.
a,
Coolio.
burned
Yeah.
in the back of a lot of our minds from our, generation,
Yeah.
and so, to me, that was, like, the reason to teach, is, like, to help those kids who weren't as,
Mhm.
didn't have the advantages I had growing up. Um, and so on the one hand, I did, was a pretty effective teacher, but on the other hand, was working in a really dysfunctional school system. So that was kind of how I went back into political advocacy as like a full-time job, was coming out of that situation and thinking, oh, wait a minute, the policy and what's going on in classrooms is totally misaligned. So let me try to do something about that. And so then I kind of went into, at first it was like very much a grassroots, working with kids, teachers, parents, and community. But then and this is right as social media starts to become a thing. So I ended up being among that first group of people who started to use social media for something other than taking pictures of your lunch. And so we were using it to organize people to marches and things like that. And so what ended up happening is that caught the attention of some of the, major uh, teachers union leaders and other folks who were doing professional advocacy. And so that's kind of how I ended up getting into professional politics. And so I came up as a digital strategist, but really was because of certain campaigns where I worked on, I basically got the opportunity to work on a variety of communications roles. And so just ended up picking up a lot of skill sets that became really useful
Mhm.
as we entered into this really digital communication sphere. And so that's really my intro into what I came to call Groupthink Inc. And I think the timing was really important because one, just in terms of this becoming a job as opposed to just something that people might do as a hobby, that was certainly not something that would be possible before that time. And now it's becoming again sort of less possible to do as content creation becomes more professionalized.
Mhm.
But also, it was that time period before we really fully knew just what these digital tools were doing to people's brains and how this is really starting to shift one, just the way people are starting to segregate into smaller and smaller little ideological echo chambers. And so that really, on the one hand, gave activists a lot of tools that we didn't have before, but on the other hand, was very dangerous in ways that we're only just now starting to fully appreciate in terms of what does it mean to really get not only be surrounded in your physical world by people with certain ideas, but still have opportunities to come across people who are different, to being able to really seal yourself into an echo chamber with almost no way of hearing other voices or breaking free of those mindsets.
Hmm. Well, that leads me to I got about 10,000 questions. I'm not going to ask all of them. I'll only ask about 9,000 of them. But no. In all seriousness, though, there's a lot to chew on there. Before we get to the whole transformative part, where it was like more of a how did you sort of break out of that? A couple of things that, from your insider perspective on this, one thing that I get from your description of the progression was it didn't start off. It was the be nice kind of a thing, which was sort of the religious background or pseudo religious background. um, was that the way the activism was too? Because now when we think of activist, I tend to think when someone says they're an activist, I tend to think angry. I tend to think sign holding. I tend to think thing throwing and lots of things that light other things on fire. That's not the way activists used to be. Um, when you were getting into that, was it sort of the kindler, gentler, more less sensational, more principlist? And then what do you think accounts for the change?
Mm, great questions. So I think I always saw that there were kind of two sort of streams, if that makes sense,
Mhm.
of activism. There were people who were kind of, we should just be nice to people, but there always was kind of a more militant side. And I think what ended up happening is that the the way things started to fracture once the digital age really started to mature is that it became a lot easier for the militant side to really enforce their viewpoint. One, the more you're doing things online, the easier it is to forget that you're dealing with real flesh and blood people on the other side, right? It's so much harder to be as really in your face, as really dogmatic about your activist perspectives when you are in face to face, person to person community with people. I didn't see as much, for example, people cutting off family members and things like that in those earlier days. There was always people who were complaining about their, more conservative family members or things like
Mhm.
that. But there wasn't this conversation of like, I am literally cutting this person out of my life. I would say before the 2010s, 2012, 2015 sort of era. I feel like that was really when the more this started to come online and the more social media became a feature of our everyday lives and organizing, that's when I think that shift really started to favor the more militant parts of the activist community who's always been there, but we're definitely not able to, because most people don't have that in them, right? Most people are not necessarily willing to do things that are going to push them too far beyond their comfort zone.
Yeah.
It's only when we got into those echo chambers, and with digital media, the thing is you have data points. You're able to see what other people are doing. You're able to see what they're sharing or not sharing, right? So if they're not posting the black square, if they're not, making a statement of a certain kind when the thing happens, whatever's trending that day, it enabled that intra-community policing that started to happen where people, and that's where you start to see the rise of cancel culture. That's when you start to see all of those shifts because now there's this ability to really see who is saying what, who's not saying what. And it's really a lot easier to start to within activist spaces. I can't even tell you how much conflict and just drama constantly characterize those spaces. There was always the infighting, there's always the joke on the left about circular firing squads and things like that. But it really got to another level when we had the technical tools to be able to see, oh, that person liked a comment from, the wrong side on a debate, or that person is following somebody. Why are they following XYZ? That person's a fascist. Like the more you have the ability to actually be able to really keep tabs on people, that militant faction of the activist community was really able to start to kind of discipline people to, either cancel them or push them out. So you see kind of waves of people leaving the left because there's certain events that happen, and if you don't fall in line exactly the way the militant wing of the group is going, then you're either pushed out or you decide to leave because you're like, oh, they've gone too far for me this time, right? And so that I think is where the shift happened is once people got the ability to, because then they can both enforce it by kind of checking up on what people are doing. They can also bring the they can basically threaten your livelihood, your safety, by, if you become the target of the day, whether that's in your, sort of leftist workplace or online, they can literally ruin your life. And most people, when they're an onlooker, they're the nice people. They learn how to just say the thing, right? Oh, we're just going to, do the pronoun ritual. We're just going to go along, right? The nice people didn't go away, but they got quiet because they've seen what happened to the people who asked the wrong questions, who didn't fall in line. And so that militant group is really able to sort of drag everybody else along with them and excommunicate whoever doesn't go along. And so I think that's really what made the difference.
You anticipated one of my follow-up questions was going to be, was there a sort of a quietly roiling resentment amongst the, hey, we're not going to get militant like this, we're not going to get upset, and you sort of anticipated that question and answered that way. And I think it's fascinating because oftentimes we think because the militancy is so pronounced that there is a unified sense of we're all this militant, when the reality is that's actually not true.
Yeah, no, it's not. And I think that's really one of the things that was really eye-opening to me is there's on the one hand, there were the people who kind of once I started to go public with my doubts about all this stuff, there were a bunch of people who, cut me off and all this other kind of stuff. But then there were a lot of people in my DMs like, thank you for saying that. I kind of felt that way too.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting because they're still not willing to say it in public, but they're, kind of in the DMs and stuff being very much like, "Oh, yeah, I'm seeing some of the same problem."
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah, that is that strange sort of, again, it's been noted before, but like the cult like or religious like, really more cult like
Mm.
behavior of, because it is, I mean, cults you tend to think of being things that make you cut out people from your life.
Mhm.
And they have these rituals, and you really want to belong to this thing. So even if you disagree, you're too afraid
Mm-hmm.
to say anything.
Yeah.
That's but this is the place for free thinkers also.
Yeah.
So how do you sort of reconcile
Yeah.
those things?
Is that kind of a thing what got you questioning the whole thing in the first place? Was it the substance of what people were saying that got you thinking, maybe I doubt this, or was it the way in which your questions were being reacted to? Hey, we'll get back to the show in just a second, but right now I wanted to tell you about my new book, Fake ID: How AI and Identity Ideology Are Collapsing Reality and What to Do About It. To tell you about the book, here's a short trailer. Something is deeply wrong, and we can all feel it. Culture tells us we're nothing but machines. It also tells us we're gods who can reshape reality by sheer will. Both can't be true, so it creates a kind of cultural schizophrenia where we can no longer tell what's authentic from what's artificial, and it's collapsing reality itself. But we're not machines to upgrade. We're not gods whose bodies are playthings or prisons. What we are is something the world is forgetting, but desperately needs to remember. Because only the truth about what we are can restore our sense of what's real. Okay, let's get back to the show.
So I think for me, a big turning point was 2020. So when the pandemic started and things, basically everything moved indoors, there was a few things that basically made possible for me. One was that it actually just pulled me out of that environment day to day. So rather than, not only being in this digital environment, but then going into an office every day where I was seeing people who were very much, steeped in the same mindset, I actually had some space and time to myself where I wasn't commuting anymore. I wasn't, doing the happy hours, all the things that you're normally doing um, when this is your professional work as well as your you know, extracurricular activities, for lack of a better term.
Mm.
And so that gave me space to just sort of look at the situation a little bit more, with a little bit more clarity. I think the other thing was just the sort of the disconnect between just how bad or how extreme our rhetoric had gotten and the how sort of milquetoast our reactions to it were. So I was working in an organization where we were basically saying, in addition to the actual pandemic, there's this pandemic of racism. There's this potential for fascist takeover of the government. Trump is not going to concede the election. What are we going to do? It's going to be a coup. Like we're saying all these really, really extreme things. But then a response to it was, so let's do an email petition. And so I'm just like, wait, what? You're saying that basically you think that we would be in like a civil war level almost crisis. But your response is an email petition. And so like
Mhm.
that was literally driving me crazy. I was just like I couldn't wrap my mind around how that could be the way we were responding. There was this one meeting in particular, I remember, where there was a lot of coalition, like a coalition of a lot of these really influential organizations. So like all of those sort of brand name progressive groups that have a lot of money, pretty closely tied to the Democratic Party. We're all talking about kind of how are we going to like meet this moment. And there were a couple of us on there, myself included, and now I'm looking back on this, I'm like, "Ooh, I'm glad I did not win that argument." But, was, like, basically like, "Oh, yeah, so this is a moment where we should be pushing for a general strike. Like, if we think that the government should pay people to stay at home so we can all survive the pandemic because it's gonna kill everybody and their grandma, then, like, we have tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars collectively represented among these groups that were earmarked for things like canvassing, house parties, rallies, all these things we're saying are irresponsible to do now because of the pandemic. So if we think that the government should pay people to stay home, why don't we do that ourselves for at least a little while to force the government to do that?" And there were like three other people who were like, "Yeah," and everybody else was like, no, more petitions. Let's do more social media. And so I was like, wait a minute. If we think this is like this sort of imminent fascist takeover of the United States, why are we still clicky clacking on our computers? Like that doesn't make any sense. And so that really started me down the rabbit hole of like, wait a minute. So if this is the way we're responding to it, how much of what we're saying is even true? And so I started to like I'd had over the years had little pangs of misgivings here and there, but I kind of immediately silenced them. And then in 2020, I was finally like, all right, let's actually start to like listen to some of those misgivings. Let's actually start to like look at how much of this is really true. And that really started to be on a years long process of rethinking everything. And then parallel to that was also my spiritual, um, you know, reconnecting with God sort of journey because I think as that whole thing was happening with my politics, in hindsight, I realized politics was basically the biggest idol in my life. Like that was really what was, my religion functionally. I wouldn't have called it that then, but functionally, this was my source of morality. This was my source of like my worldview, how I thought things, why I thought things were the way they were. And so once politics had been knocked off the throne, God had an opening to, really actually resume his rightful place in that part of my life, and so that was really what shifted for me.
Mm. So walk us through that a little bit more too. I want to get to a couple of the ideas we're talking about in terms of groupthink itself, but and what that all means. But just because obviously given the content of our channel, but also just my desire to know what was the spiritual awakening like. Obviously, with politics being dethroned, God has a moment where He can come in and actually take His rightful place, as you said. What got you thinking that God should be the one that does that? And was there what did you wrestle with? What did you come to appreciate? All that kind of stuff about the Christian message that made that more alluring than perhaps anything else that could have taken the place in the vacuum.
Sure. I think, part of it is I just credit God with all the things. Like I think he, has the way he's working in everybody's lives for his purposes all the time. I think for me, what started me to, so I had kind of years before I had had an experience with God that really sort of cemented for me that he's real, that he's present in my life, that sort of thing. But I was still in that relativistic, pluralistic mindset of there's lots of different ways to get to him. And so because I didn't have a sense of the authority of scripture, I didn't have a sense that that should be any, sort of major part of my life. Even when I first had the thought to take my spirituality more seriously, to become religious in any sense of the word, I pretty quickly was diverted off of that. Politics was really front and center.
Hmm.
And then I really fell very headlong into sort of working hard, organizing by day and then organizing by night. But now we're at the bar instead of in an office or, on a wherever we were. And so when that started to really get really, because you can only do that for so long before it really starts to mess with your mental health. And so then I started to get into things like meditation to sort of reclaim my mental health in a certain sense. And then, but meditation very quickly started to spiral into like, oh, like I had a yoga practice kind of long standing from then, but then I started to get into like tarot cards and astrology and hoodoo, because this was also a cultural moment where it was like, all black everything. And so like really starting to get into all these different pagan spiritualities as well. And then so I was doing a lot of that, but then I started to start seeing just more things were just coming on my, again, my algorithm is like a big part of things too. So I have like, I was big on Instagram at that point.
Mhm.
And so there were different things kind of just popping up into my algorithm. A lot of it was pulling me towards, the tarot, astrology, all that kind of stuff. But I had a couple of friends here and there, praise God for them, who would occasionally share a video from like, someone's sermon or things like that. And so there was a part of me that was like, oh yeah, that's right. God, Bible, Christian, okay. And so I was like at that point, it's I was still kind of like the coexist bumper sticker,
Uh-huh.
and so like never mind that a lot of those blatantly contradict each other, but and so that was kind of where I was at. Once I started to sort of fall away from the politics stuff, but then I was still dabbling in all these different spiritual things. There's this one, and this is such an embarrassing story, but God gets the glory in the end. So I was literally watching this thing where um this guy starts talking about using the Psalms for like witchcraft purposes. Horrible, horrible stuff.
Mm.
But again, I'm not in the mindset of like God is someone to whom I owe any kind of obedience or allegiance. To me, I'm still in that consumerist mindset of all of this is available for me to pick and choose from, to use for my own self-care and whatever else. Because again, that's that mindset that I was grown up in, right? Like the where I grew up in New Jersey was basically like shopping mall end to end with like, a few off ramps to go to school or something else.
Right.
So like very much that just consumerist mindset. And Oprah was probably like the one like, sort of predominant, that was appointment television in my household. Every day at 4 p.m.,
Mhm.
you know, you sat your butt down and I could hear the little theme song even now. And so um I really had that mindset of just like, okay, just do all the things. But so this guy starts talking about using the Psalms. And so I was like, oh, that's an interesting idea. And so I swiped out of Instagram, got on the App Store and downloaded the YouVersion Bible app. And then as soon as I got into that, like I abandoned whatever I thought I was going to do with that little Psalms, grimoire situation. Thank God.
Mm.
And there's that streak feature. And so I just got the sort of reading, like even just a little verse of the day. So then I started a plan. And then I started just reading the Bible every day. And it just started to work in me. Like it just started to, like, I just started to actually. So then I was like, you know what? Like, I'm just going to read this whole thing. Like, I've never even, like, I've had a Bible. And that point, too, like, I had like at least 2 Bibles somewhere in my house that I was not paying attention to.
Mhm.
But I just started reading it every day, and then I got, I really like to have like I have a few different ones all around, but I really like a Bible I can hold, and so I was keeping track of like, different like daily reading plans and stuff like that.
Mhm.
But it was just I just started reading it every day. And by that point, so that job that was driving me crazy, the people who were gonna, petition their way out of a coup,
Mhm.
I quit at the end of that 2020. And so that gave me some time and space. I went into business for myself, just doing, communications consulting where I could. But that gave me a lot of time and flexibility to just spend the first part of my day in the Word. And so I just ended up just reading it straight through. And that began a yearly, at least yearly. The first year I actually read through the Bible twice. And then after that was just reading through every single year. And so at first there was stuff I didn't understand. There's stuff that I was, still kind of like, but over time, like it really does renew your mind. Like you actually start to, and part of that too, obviously, is the indwelling Holy Spirit. Um, Backing up just a quick moment. One of the things that happened in the process of quitting my job is like, I was like, I physically cannot see there, my bosses were talking to me about like our plans for January and after the inauguration and stuff like that. And I was like, I physically cannot see that far in advance being here.
Mm.
Like I was getting it was just driving me so crazy the way we were just um the unserious way we were approaching this apparently serious situation. And so I at one point I was cracking up laughing and then I was just sobbing
Mm.
like on my bathroom floor, like having a meltdown. And I like for the first time really cried out to God, like, I don't know what is going on in the future, but I know I can't trust these people. I'm trusting you for it. Like, and that was sort of the very first beginning of like me actually repenting
Mm.
because when I had first kind of met God, I'll say, it was like I was in a pit of exhaustion. I was working at that school where everything was kind of crazy. And I was kind of like, God help me, like these, this is a crazy situation. And then by the time I got to 2020, I was like, I must have taken a lot of wrong turns
Mhm.
to be in this situation. And so, of course, I feel like there's part of that is the working of the Holy Spirit, like regenerating you to get you to see
Mhm.
your own sinfulness for what it is. But so that got me to a place where I was actually able to repent and actually just be able to be like, all right, God, I clearly don't know what's going on. These people clearly don't know what's going on. So I'm going to just leave this in your hands, like, just whatever it is you want to do with me in my life, like, please do it. Like, I don't even know what to do anymore. And
Yeah.
so that really was a turning point. And then so after that was when I really started just reading the Bible every day. At first, I was unfortunately pulling a tarot card and reading the Bible,
Mhm.
but eventually got far enough into Deuteronomy. It was like, oh no, not supposed to be doing that. And so eventually, put that away, tore up all the cards and new age books and new thought stuff. And then had just been rocking with Jesus ever since.
Yeah, I gotta
That's awesome.
say, um, I resonate with first of all, I think everyone resonates with that story if they take a look and they can see their own journey in reading the Word, as it is a transformative thing. When I look at my own story, is that I started taking the Bible seriously when two guys came to our apartment complex when I was an undergraduate at the University of Michigan. And I wanted to debunk this book because, as a Muslim, I believe that the Quran came to fix all of that, all the
Mhm.
corruptions that entered into the text. And it was Luke chapter 3, verses 7 and following, where John the Baptist basically challenges people to say, are you believing something because of tradition, because you've always thought that
Mhm.
way, and because the group thinks that way? Or do you believe it because it's true? And what's true is what saves, not what's tradition. Now, if tradition and truth happen to line up, fantastic. But if they don't, you need to forsake the one in favor of the other. And that got me thinking. And so, one of the things I've often said, and what your testimony is living proof of this, is that you can be around some of the most eloquent, passionate, logical people in the whole world. And sometimes they go off the rails, but sometimes, and I've been around, and I've had the blessing of being around people who are just the most articulate people I've ever met, who are defenders of the Christian faith. And every single one of them would say that nothing they say is as transformative, as powerful as the Bible they're speaking about in the first place. So it is
Amen.
the word that actually transforms. So what I've often said is, may we never speak with lofty arguments and a closed Bible. Is that
Mm.
oftentimes if we speak with lofty arguments, that's all they end up being. But if they're not backed up by something, and if we don't present the words of the scriptures themselves, to augment, not even to augment, but to ground what we're saying, what are we saying really? And the second thing that comes to mind is that recently I had the privilege of being at an event where Craig Rochelle was speaking. And Craig Rochelle, he's the pastor of Life Church, the largest church in America. And they actually started the Bible app. And they love to hear
Right.
stories just like this, where people get into it, whether they turn to a paper Bible or not, they don't care. They just are thrilled to know that the Bible app actually did something, where it piqued someone's interest into keep reading the Bible. And the streak feature was just a stroke of genius. So anyway, all that to say that I'm super thrilled that the word was such a big part of your spiritual journey and your spiritual odyssey and experience. So just wanted to interject those 2 points into a otherwise extremely just amazing story. Just love to hear that kind of stuff. And I also love the fact that it's not this dramatic thing where you fell and saw some vision and this you just kind of like read truth and it resonated. I love that.
Yeah, I mean, the word is living and active, right? It truly is. Like it does the word does not return void. It accomplishes exactly the purpose for which God sends it. And so just praise God for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and but so I knew this was gonna happen because I've not heard like a longer kind of version of your conversion, but we had this whole plan. We've made it through very little of this because the conversation's been so good that
No, no. Sorry about that.
that we're already we need to be thinking about part two and part three.
Yeah.
But but I want to bring it back a little bit,
Mhm.
not all the way back, but I want to before we jump into because I want to talk about some stuff that's been going on um recently. And but part of your journey was also you went into this world, and we talked about you coming out of it and coinciding with and actually being reinforced by your reading of the scriptures. But could you describe for everyone, because we've mentioned it a couple times, so I want to make sure people understand when we talk about, and when you coined the phrase groupthink Inc. And the sort of even the counter disinformation space that you were in, which is being, I think, counter, disinformation, the whole labeling something as dis or misinformation has been used as a bludgeon
Hmm.
against dissenting views.
Mhm.
Um, wh- wh- Help us. I mean, what is the counter disinformation space? And you mentioned group thinking because you said one time, wokeism isn't a cult, but it's the product of a subversive industry that uses well-meaning people as workers and customers. And it's interesting that you sort of
Right.
took it to this, this business level, this financial level, even what you were talking about before too. Of it seems almost performative. They're sort of trying to get the passions up in people to get them to do the social media things they want them to do and maybe donate more, but they're not really acting like they think a civil war is going to happen. Um, so what was that
Right.
space like? And give us an insider's view of what went on there.
Yeah, so I mean, I always say that it is an industry that and the reason it looks and feels so much like a cult is because it's running on the same hardware, right? Like, it's still the human mind, and so the same social and cognitive dynamics that are essential to the functioning of a mind control cult are very much in play for anything that's trying to seek influence in people's lives, which includes, the political industry. And so the reason I really look at the industrial incentives of it and just that piece of it is because I think that is so central to why it functions the way it does now. Aside from the piece we talked about just the way technology has really accelerated the ability to both influence people, but then also control them through social pressure. There's also this piece of in previous and especially like further back before we have, sort of professional or, professionalized organizations doing charity work and things like that. In order to build a social movement, it had to be responding to very, very dire circumstances in the real world because the people who would be the boots on the ground of that movement would have to be making a trade off between doing that and doing the day to day work of life, right? For most of, prior history, you had to like it took time. I'm a baker now, so I do a lot of like, sourdough and stuff like that. I mill my own grain. And just that process, even though I have like an electric miller on my stand and I'm only cooking for like 3 or 4 people every day, just the fact that like that takes more time than me just buying a loaf of bread or having something DoorDash to my house, right? People had like real responsibilities when they had big families, when they had like, real day-to-day work they had to do that couldn't be outsourced to an app on their phone and things like that. And so those movements now there's, histories of infiltration and things being, sort of diverted to bad purposes in the past too, but not to the same extent because there's that built-in thing of like most people are not going to bother with something if it's taking away from their very urgent work of making a living, caring for their families. We have now, especially in the past few decades, this whole sort of industry full of people whose full-time job is spreading. So if you think about, I don't know how many folks, and this might be another little like red pill moment for some folks who haven't heard of like Yuri Bezmenov and people like that. But when there was like sort of a very intentional push to change how our like academia itself functions. Like, what are the guiding assumptions of it? What worldviews are platformed? What worldviews are suppressed? Things like that. And then a generation later, right, those people who were trained in that captured academy then go into other professions. They're in public schools, they're in cultural shaping institutions like newspapers, TV, film, etc. When that sort of thing happens, sort of 60s, 70s onward, there's now this whole new generation on both ends of the political spectrum, but to a greater extent on the left. There's all these institutions and then organizations where there are people who now it's their full-time job to be thinking about politics, to be trying to affect policy. And so now there are, literally millions of people for whom it is one, the primary thing they spend all of their time doing, but it's also their source of livelihood. to continually be quote unquote fighting the power, even though, after a certain point they were the power, but that's not a very, that's not a great sales, selling point. You're trying to get people to donate to you because, blah, blah, blah. But so there's people whose full-time job it is to popularize these sort of academic fads, things that used to be just kind of a flight of fancy for college students, and then they would outgrow it when they got into the real world and had to do real things. There's now a lot of people who never actually have to go out into the real world and do real things.
Mm,
And there's also
mm,
even more people who spend a lot of their time now on their phones doing things as opposed to having to do, again, like having to make that choice between, is this cause worth me actually investing time and energy in? Or is my time better spent with my friends, my family, et cetera, doing real things? And so that piece that there's this industry, there are people within it. And especially if you're spending all day, every day in it, there are people who start to see it the way they're talking about it. Like, I don't believe that, like, there are some people who are very much like, oh, yeah, you get them at a bar after hours and they will tell you that this whole thing is a scam, right? They will just be very free with that.
oh,
There
wow.
are some people who very much, because they went to, they grew up hearing this sort of thing in school, they went to college hearing this sort of thing, then they got into, this industry, and they're online in the same little algorithm bubble that's reinforcing that message. There are some people who very much do believe we are living in fascism, that things have never been worse. I'm like, tell that to my grandparents, tell that
Hmm.
to my ancestors who were literally enslaved. um, there are some people who very much, because they spend all their time in this, like, just certain cognitive biases that we all have, right? The illusory truth effect, like those certain things that if you just hear things repeated over and over again, you do come to believe them.
Hmm.
And because it is their livelihood, there's so many incentives for them to never actually stop and think, wait a minute, could my political opponents have a point? Wait a minute, could Uncle Joe and Joe, so and so at the Thanksgiving table who, watches the different news station from me, like, could he actually have a point? If you even get to the point of asking yourself that, the threat of both social ostracization, and if you're somebody who works in Groupthink Inc., the thought, the potential loss of livelihood, you're just like, you're not going to stop. You're gonna be just, "Nope, I'm gonna keep going down the road I'm already going down." Because, like, it's between this being all you've ever been exposed to and these other incentives, social pressure and the financial pressure, it's very this is why I always say to people, I'm like, "It took a years-long act of God to break me out of this,"
Hmm.
because I had no, like, the pressure on the other side of it, you have to have something much bigger than your income, your social circles. And so when for me, realizing, wait a minute, God is my source, not this organization, not this movement, not these people, not this contract. God is my source, and He can use anyone and anything to make sure that I have, I think about Matthew 6 a lot, of just like, look at the birds, right? Consider the lilies.
Hmm.
Like, if He doesn't let even a sparrow fall to the ground, outside of His sovereignty, then I can trust Him as His daughter to look out for me. And so having that conviction was much bigger than thinking about all these people who are, because then the other thing too is, as I'm sort of rewiring my brain in truth and seeing those lies, it's like, oh, these people are really confused. This is really rock solid. But getting back to sort of that question of just the sort of this industry, right? Like, people get locked in it because there's these sort of interlocking pressures, right? There's the social pressure, there's the financial incentives, and then there's also this very warped environment we inhabit in this digital space, in this digital era.
Hmm.
And so there's so many incentives to invest your identity in it, especially if you don't have something more solid competing for that space.
That brings to mind two things that I remember. There's an Upton Sinclair quote, and he says that it
Mm,
is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it.
yeah.
There's that. And that really resonates in some ways with me too, because when I look at why it is that it took me 9 years to become a Christian as opposed to the 2 years where I found all the answers I needed, but wrestled with what the steps for 7 more years, what the answers might mean, is that there's a cost to this. There's always a cost. And I've said this on numerous occasions where it's not just the religious people who change from Islam to Christianity or Hinduism to Christianity or leave religion altogether who have this sense of cost. We bake everything into our identities, including and especially politics. And I think that's one of the things that is such an important thing for us to really understand why you have a hard time if you're from one political persuasion and you're talking to somebody from another and you're making good points and you're wondering why is this otherwise intelligent thoughtful person so resistant to it. It's because they have a conviction as opposed to an opinion, and a conviction is
Yes.
something you hold with a closed fist, and an opinion you hold with an open hand. And if you ever try to pry someone's fist open when they don't want it to be open, it hurts you and them. So it does
Right.
take sort of an act of God, but I don't want to make it a sort of a despair message either that says
Yeah,
we have
no.
to pray for miracles, and the only way someone will change their mind if as a miracle happens. And we thank God that does happen. But there was a slow erosion too. There was a
Mhm.
my guess is were there people in your life who were actually helping along that were sort of like getting outside of groupthink Inc.
So for me, it really was, and this is one of the reasons where I felt in some ways compelled to start a Substack and a YouTube is because for me, what really did it was once I had questions, I didn't have people like I had built my whole life. This is company town where I'm, in DC area, like
Hmm.
everybody is locked in there, for the most part, is either employed by the government or is in some sort of political field.
Hmm.
Or not everybody, but a significant proportion. Certainly the people that the circles I ran in. And so I didn't have a whole lot of people around me who were thinking and doing something different. But what I did have is the internet. And so I started to just, especially once I was in the counter disinformation space, and we can talk a little bit more about that because I know
Yeah.
Derek is interested there, is I just started seeing again, it was a lot of like sort of, once I was not as invested in this, in group thinking, basically, once I stopped being so invested in them for my social validation and for my just everything in my life, I was more willing to entertain other viewpoints. But I didn't have people, but I did have access to just voices, right? People who were posting their critiques, people who were sharing their own leaving the left stories, people who were talking about their conversion stories, right? What brought them to Christianity? Why did they believe the Bible was true? Like I found those different things and was able to piece some of those together. I think in particular, sort of my time in the counter disinfo space was really pivotal there too, because, whereas 2020 got me just sort of like, all right, I'm going to stopping myself from questioning when I see things that are dysfunctional in the space I'm in. What was very interesting was that because the way this industry is set up is that the way they would put it forth is basically they're trying to protect democracy from people who are or any of a number of fields, right? Not just democracy, from people who are deliberately misinforming the public. Now, that would seem to be a very nonpartisan or cross-partisan affair if that's really your interest, right? Setting aside for the fact that, like, if you're there, there's why anybody should trust this, group of people who to appoint themselves to be like the arbiters of truth is a whole other ridiculous thing.
Hmm.
But even if you accept that on its face, what I started to see was one, that this was still very much an insular group of people. I was already started, really like kind of over the fecklessness of the left by that point. And so I was trying to do things that on the one hand, I'm like, if there are groups here and there who are doing something good, I'll work with them. But when I found that more and more people were coming to me to do this counter disinfo kind of stuff, I kept finding myself in the same kinds of spaces I had trying to leave. And so I was like, already like, wait, what? If we're just interested in truth here, like there's no political party has a monopoly on truth, no ideal like this should not be this ideologically uh mono or what's the word I'm looking for? Like this shouldn't be this uh same across the board, right? There shouldn't be this
Hmm.
just like sort of monopoly of ideas or monoculture of ideas
Hmm.
that we're seeing here. So that was a red flag for me. The other thing I started to be able to see, so I was on the side of people who were kind of just training people in how to propagate messages that it bolstered the truth. So I spend a lot of my time. One of the things that I just always had an interest in, psych is part of my background academically, and so I've always been interested in social and cognitive psychology, but then also in how, um, basically, what is it that makes susceptible to lies? What is it that makes people, more amenable to the truth? And so, one, I started to see people that I was working with that I started to feel that conviction that I couldn't work with anymore because I was like, wait a minute, you're using the manipulation tactics I warn trainees against on uh, your own members. You're using them on your own donors. And so I'm like, I can't, that feels so unethical to me that I can't participate in that. The other thing I saw is that I would be part of these networks, and whereas I was training people who were kind of going out to be like communicators, activists, folks like that, there was this whole sort of fleet of people who were just there monitoring stuff on the internet. And then they would work hand in hand with like the platform, like trust and safety,
Yeah.
um, to basically spotlight what kinds of content, especially back during the Biden administration when they would actually be more strong arm to like pull content down and things like that.
Mhm.
Um, and so they were monitoring all this stuff, but their monitoring tools were aimed almost exclusively at conservative voices. Like they were not like, and because in part, like it would be almost impossible to literally have any kind of a tool that is literally there, just being an arbiter of truth, right? That's not a thing that exists.
Mhm.
But to the extent that you're monitoring anything, you should be monitoring neutrally of like, okay, this is what is true on this particular topic, and then let's, flag stuff that isn't. They were just completely their tools were exclusively trained on conservative voices, on outlets, on conservative influencers, et cetera. And so I was like, this is very clearly an ideological effort here. Like, this is very clearly an effort to silence your opponents because when I started to ask people, well, how do you know what's true is true? Like, how do you, I would just ask people these questions and they would just be like, that's really deep. You're so smart to ask that question. And I'm like, okay, but you are involved in like multi-continental efforts to stifle speech. You might want to think about
Yeah.
how do you know what's true is true? And you're working with these government officials who have a very huge power incentive. You're working with, in some cases, industries, the medical industry, the like there's a bunch of different industries that have a very vested interest in their perspective being held up as the truth and everything else being suppressed.
Mm.
And so like these are questions you should ask.
Mhm.
With the counter disinfo thing, what I started to see is just how they were very clearly stifling certain things. So we would have these meetings across these coalitions that I would participate in. And so they wanted me to be kind of read into what was going on so that when I would be doing trainings, I could kind of speak specifically to some of the things that they were seeing. But what that ended up doing, sort of accidentally on their part, is exposing me to stuff that was completely hidden from my algorithm
Oh, wow.
because I was still in my little echo chamber. I was kind of starting to change it just by virtue of choosing different content. So it was slowly, evolving. But because my friends and the people I was following were still pretty much the same people that I had been, following for the previous, however long social media existed up to that point, I was still very much in that algorithmic bubble that was showing me, sort of the approved party line for,
Mhm.
millennial woman living in a predominantly progressive area who has this much income, blah, blah, blah. Like I was still sorted into that bubble. And so when they were sharing, like, these are the things that are trending on the, like, the misinformation or the disinformation things that we need to watch. I was starting to see all these stories about like, oh, wow, really huge downsides to illegal immigration. Oh, there's actually some, the consensus around gender is completely different than what is being represented,
Mhm.
in these spaces and things like that. And so that actually started to tip me off to other people to be like, oh, actually, maybe let me see what this Charlie Kirk has to say. Or
Mhm.
like, let me, it was actually tipping me off to like investigate some of these other people and voices that I would never have considered beforehand. And so that ended up paradoxically actually being an opening for me to see something different because I was seeing just the way one, I was seeing the shortcomings of this particular effort, but I was also actually being introduced to stories and ideas that were completely hidden to me as a, person who was in this particular algorithm bubble, who's, was like a Washington Post and New York Times subscriber. I was never seeing those viewpoints until they would actually be filtered back out as like a trend story, right? Oh, there's these right-wing voices that are attacking immigrants, or there's these right-wing voices that are transphobic. They would repackage the stories that they couldn't contain in quarantine away from the general public. They would repackage so that people seeing them would view them through a certain lens that was not hospitable or that was not charitable
Mhm.
to them actually being able to take that viewpoint seriously. And so just seeing that whole process of just how information was being both sort of sequestered away from people and then repackaged in certain ways to kind of reinforce the viewpoint that they wanted was just really eye-opening. And the other thing that I'll say too is that there's probably a tendency for people to hear what I'm saying kind of through a conspiratorial lens.
Mhm.
I would say that the people doing this are as brainwashed or more. Some of them, again, there are a few people who are very intentional about what they're doing. They're very fully aware that what they're doing is wrong, and they're just happy to cash the checks. But for the most part, a lot of the people working in them are just very well-meaning, high achieving kids who just went through this system that teaches you to see the world a certain way. And then they're just taught that this is the way that they can make a difference. And so their ego and their just people pleasing nature, their desire to want to do the right thing, and this is what they've been told is right by the people who are authoritative in their lives, they are as brainwashed or more
Yeah.
than the people that they are actually influencing.
Mm, mm. Well, that b- when I think about like that consensus thing, for example, and you wrote an article about this, about when consensus cracks, because Jesse Singal came up with an article, who is left leaning, and he says this even in the article itself in the New York Times. He's looked at the gender affirming care scientific consensus, for example, from, in his own words, a left center perspective, and even he is seeing, hey, they sort of lied to us, or at least we're slightly misleading, if not far more than just slightly misleading, because the consensus actually isn't there. And one of the things that he said was interesting about this, and you begin to see this as these lawsuits start to win, and whether it's Fox Varian, or it was the first one to actually win, and you're going to see quite a few more. Chloe Cole, who was on our show, her lawsuit is now able to proceed, and she'll probably, well, we'll see what happens, because as a lawyer, I can tell you, I know these things develop over time, and who knows what settlements are reached or whatever. But knowing her, I think that she might go all the way to this with this thing, and at least have the evidence come out. You're seeing this now. You're seeing the consensus start to crack, and then establishment establishment organizations like the AMA and the American Society of Plastic Surgeons and others are starting to say, well, we should wait. But they were the same organizations that were saying a year and a half ago, there's mass consensus. And what I thought was interesting, and I wouldn't mind if you explored this a little bit further, because you wrote a wonderful article on this, is they were actually talking about each other to each other and calling that consensus. And consensus and research are different things. So
Yeah.
I think that this plays into what you just said, is that there are people who are as brainwashed or more than the people who have brainwashed them into this thing. Is that the reason we believe things, and we believe things are true, is because enough people have said it often enough, and then we start to hear the echo back. And that's classic echo chamber stuff, but there's an actual phenomenon where we begin to believe things are true because enough people have said them enough times.
Yeah, I think it's one of these things that, and this is, I've actually working on something else right now, another like sort of video essay around just kind of how does this happen, especially to people who are theoretically supposed to be like our best and brightest, right? Because I think if we look at the data on who bought into things like gender ideology, it is very disproportionately skewed toward very affluent, very, sort of, oh, like, I struggle with the term educated now even because I'm just like, what are like, there's
Yeah.
it's a lot of conditioning and, sort of, um, miseducation going on to the if you can go in, kind of sure about basic things and then come out, confused about stuff you knew as like a toddler, like, have you been educated? But the what ends up happening is because you are surrounded by people who, have these really they're the experts, quote unquote, right? Like this was the whole idea is that they were constantly like, and this ended up being one of the things that pushed me out of the disinfo industry is because I ended up actually having with one of my biggest clients in that space, having this conversation about because I was like, when there was this moment where so I had left the organizations I was working for, and then I went into business for myself. And the people who would come to me as clients were seeking me for this particular type of work. How do we spread narratives that counteract disinformation?
Mm-hmm.
And then there were some folks who were earnestly trying to do, combat different kinds of things. But there was this growing number of just very clearly ideologically, like you're just, there were people coming to me from like gender clinics or through some of the clients that I was working with. They were working with like gender clinicians, or I shouldn't say clinicians because this is not really medical. Like it uses medical
Right.
tools and
Yeah.
drugs, but it's not a medical process.
Right.
And so these gender, facilities, these gender drugs and surgeries, like they were becoming, and they're like, oh, we're getting really clobbered in some of these state legislative hearings by these Republicans asking gotcha questions like, what is a woman? And I was like, whoop. And so I would be on the call and her like, the other 5 or 6 people on the call would be like, how can we help? And I'm sitting there like, tearing my camera off, like, what? You're literally coming to me as a professional communication strategist to help you answer a question like, what is a woman? What are you doing for your patients? If you can't even answer that question, if they're coming in saying, I think I was born a woman, so help me make me one. What are you doing for like it was just like none of it made any sense.
Mm.
And so I actually started once I started having that happen to me more than once, I was like, wait a minute, I need to go back and read some things. So I even just the thing that initially radicalized me on this issue, radicalized me as in got me back to the fundamentals of
Yeah.
what is true,
Yeah.
was reading the WPATH guidelines. Like I just read them.
Mhm.
And what I actually like went through them and I was like, their own like some of their footnotes don't even support the points that they're even there to cite, right? Like it was even within their own materials, this was not making sense.
Mhm.
And so that really I was just like, what is going on here? How can it be possible that so many people have really been sucked into believing things that are just blatantly untrue, right? Like that are you can just look at bodies, you can just look at just very basic, the most basic understanding of what does it mean scientifically to be male or female, right? What kind of gametes, right? Sex cells is your body organized around. That's the definition, right? You either are the kind of body that is, organized around the production of eggs, or the kind of body that's organized around the production of sperm. Like they were, and then you would see these people playing fast and loose with that, like trying to import the secondary sex characteristics into it to try to shift things, like all these shenanigans. And so that really set me off on a path of thinking about how is it that people get caught up in this kind of thing? Because these are people who literally have the data right in front of them to refute what they're saying, right? Even in the footnotes in the WPATH guidelines in the section that's for kids, they the first time I was exposed to the fact that there was a body of research showing that the overwhelming majority of kids will outgrow that
Mhm.
if they're just left to mature in peace was in the WPATH guidelines. So
Mhm.
I was like, I was offended and I was enraged. I was just like my hair was on fire. I was like, these people have every bit of like they know that what they were pushing for, like, this was the same time they were pushing to lower the age at which you would start to do interventions like puberty blockers.
Mhm.
They already had the data right in front of them to show if you just leave these kids alone, most of them are going to outgrow these feelings.
Mhm.
And so I was like, they're playing right in our faces.
Mhm.
Like, and so to see the people who were like getting behind computers, trying to get people kicked off of, social media platforms, which in many cases were their entire livelihoods, their sources of income for saying things that these people know very well is true. Like it was so eye-opening to me that and so then I started to think about like, because on the one hand, I have never been like personally treated poorly by any of these people. So I'm like, how is it that people who are seemingly very intelligent and who are seemingly not intentionally mean, how are they getting to a place where they're doing things that are so destructive? Like, and then and are still able to tell themselves they're on the right side of history, that they're, being compassionate and all this other kind of stuff. And so part of that was part of the journey. Like one of the things that was a stumbling block for me to Christianity, frankly, was just this, having to let go of the idea that we're innately good. I had to really wrestle with the fact that like, oh, a lot of people actually, even their very good intentions sit alongside some really dark realities about human nature. Most of these people most of the people who were kind of parroting these things, especially among the sort of lower level activists and stuff like that, these were people who are not necessarily like, this is not Mr. Burns twiddling his
Mhm.
mustache or whatever else, like big business tycoon. These are people who were really selling out, in some cases, their own family members, children, etc., because of pride, right? Because they were just didn't, they were just had the fear of man, which is a snare, right? Like I was seeing this was proving the Bible true, like right in front of me, of seeing like how so many people just got so caught by the fear of man that they could not, even when they started to see something that was maybe, off about this discussion, they couldn't bring themselves to say it out loud or to admit it because they didn't want to be ostracized, they didn't want to be canceled, they didn't want to lose their jobs. And so imagine like a lot of people are doing this for very little more than just like the ego boost of feeling better than Republicans
Mhm.
and a nonprofit salary.
Mhm.
Like it didn't take that much because there is this part of us again that just does not necessarily that chooses our comfort over what's right.
Yeah.
The other thing it showed me is just that when you have people who are very authoritative because of their title, right? We have this, sort of credentialist kind of culture.
Mhm.
the experts saying something, people don't even stop to think, wait a minute. Like they were pursuing these platform policies that were deplatforming people for saying true things about issues like gender based on quote unquote, well, the facts say because the experts say. And I'm like, I'm holding the experts stuff and it's literally just like like within their own documents, they're admitting that what they're saying is not true.
Mhm.
And so, or at the very least, that they have access to information that proves that what they're saying is not true.
Right.
And so it was very clear that there were, so many people were just kind of with their whole chest. The experts say the science is settled because they had not ever bothered to read any of this. They were just saying, oh, well, WPATH and AAP and all these other people said it, so it must be true.
Mhm.
And they were never start. And so really recognizing like, oh, people are very highly educated are just as susceptible to the same cognitive biases, and in some cases are even worse off. Because whereas if you barely made it out of high school and you recognize that you have like things that you don't know, you actually have the ability to say to yourself, you know what, I don't know what I don't know, or things like that. Whereas people who are really super, they've got a lot of credentials, they've got a lot of degrees, they've been told they're smart their whole lives, it's harder for them to think, to question themselves.
Mhm.
So they can get sucked into some really bad ideas for a really long time because if the paper of record is still saying that this is the thing to be doing, if all the news outlets that they follow have a guideline that says we only use people's preferred pronouns, we only take the professional organization's word for anything, as long as those things are in place. And that I could go on for days with this one because this was like quite a deep rabbit hole, just seeing the process of like there's basically one guy who was largely responsible for drafting the American Academy of Pediatrics position paper on this.
Mhm.
And there was like a couple of other people looking over his shoulder. The vast majority, there's trying to say that this huge consensus exists when in most cases these organizations there was like a handful of people within these organizations, even if even a handful, making these determinations. And so it just really shows you how little people are actually digging into any of this.
Yeah.
Once they heard their peers, the people that they respect, were saying something, that they're really substituting their social status for actual judgment, for actual searching for evidence.
Yeah, this goes right back to that whole uh, reality collapse thing I was talking. I've written
Mm,
about it. Is that Asa Raskin and Tristan Harris were talking about artificial intelligence, and one of the things that we run a risk of, despite its many benefits, is that if we give in to some of the things that it will do for us and do our thinking
mm,
for us, and then reinforce the echo chambers times a billion, what the algorithms do. The algorithms are now run on not just machine learning, but the new way in which AI does stuff will experience what they called reality collapse. And in this 1 hour video, they spent 1.5 seconds talking about reality collapse and then moved on. And I thought, whoa, hold on a second. That's a big term. Nothing else matters if that happens. And one of the things I talk about is this idea of collapse by concealment, is that it's one
mm,
thing to give you a deep fake and uh, actively say something is something that's untrue and get you to say it persuasively enough so that you believe this untrue thing. But it's another thing altogether, or it's a part of the strategy to collapse reality by concealment, so that you think there's a consensus when you know that there isn't one, and you propagate it because other people have simply said it, and then you get things like the Cass report that comes out and says,
mhm.
by the way, there is no good reason to believe that this gender affirming care actually works. And Hillary Cass basically says, hey, why don't we just put a pause? She doesn't say don't do it. She doesn't say it's wrong. She doesn't say it's mutilating children. She just says there's no good evidence right now. Maybe we should put a pause on doing things to kids until we have good reason to believe that this stuff actually helps anybody. And she got vilified for that.
Mhm.
And then it turns out WPATH and the Tavistock and all these folks were withholding information and trying to mess with not Harvard, sorry, Johns Hopkins stuff on this as well. And you're thinking, oh my goodness, why isn't this a huge story? And it's because of the groupthink Inc. kind of a thing that you've been talking about. So this fits right in along the lines of this whole thing. And by the way, you said something else earlier that time runs short. And so if you would give us the honor and privilege of having you on again, we'd love to talk more about some of this stuff.
For
Um,
sure.
but I'll tell you one thing that stood out to me is when you said that the Bible is literally being proven right in front of your eyes, in terms of human nature and these kind of things. That's one of the things we've talked about a lot in terms of the Bible being, and I quote this oftentimes. Leslie Newbigin has this book, the title of which is amazing. It's Christ, Our Eternal Contemporary. And the
Mm.
idea there is that Jesus is, though he does his ministry on this earth, walking around the earth in an ancient time in a culture far different than the West, everything he does tends to be contemporary. It speaks to the contemporary issues. The Garden of Eden story speaks to the very things you're talking about. The Tower of Babel story speaks to these exact things we're
Mhm.
talking about in terms of the human desire to ascend to godhood and control not only the narrative, but also control what we believe to be truth itself. And the Bible speaks to this, though anciently written. And so it suggests strongly that this book was not written by a handful of shepherds and some fishermen, but was
Come
actually
on.
guided by the one in whom all existence actually hangs, and then uses those shepherds and fishermen and kings and poets and women of various statures to express his truth
Yeah.
in their unique and diverse ways. So it's just funny when I hear someone who's actually gone through it and then sort of woken up because the Bible is literally being proven true in front of their very eyes. It gets me excited. So you can tell that I'm very excited. I loved listening to what you have to say about this because there you have it. It's right there with someone who, as thoughtful as you are, comes to this conclusion completely independently of anything that I've said or anybody else has said. This is just a remarkable thing. I don't know. I get excited when I see this kind of stuff happening right in front of me and I hear this kind of story. So I knew your story a bit, but when you said that just now, that was like, man, that's important and powerful stuff right there because that itself is an apologetic answer to the way the culture actually works. The Bible predicts it and provides a remarkable remedy for it at the same time. It doesn't just criticize humanity; it actually
Right.
seeks to redeem it through these kind of things. So, um, anyway, that's kind of just my denouement to what you had to say, which was so powerful. And I just hope that folks rewind it, go back and listen to what you shared through that commentary because it's such an important thing. Every bit of that is just pregnant with meaning. So thanks so much for sharing that and for joining us for the podcast. I'm sure we didn't get to half of the questions we had written out, but just such good stuff from all this. So what are you working on next? What can people look forward to?
Yeah, so yeah, thank you, and I'm a talker, so I know I probably
Join
didn't
the
get to
club on
ask
that
the
one, by the way.
question.
Yeah. We love
But,
that.
but yeah, so I'm just kinda getting started with swordplay, and continuing to kinda chug along with leaving group thinking, and so really just looking forward to sharing more as I'm able. Just kind of untangling, like, these bits. As I said earlier, it was really helpful to me to see other people's stories, which are a little bit different from mine, but some parallels, and that was part of what helped me to turn away from what was false toward what was true, and so hoping to be able to do that for other folks who are in a similar position to myself.
Mhm.
So yeah, so on YouTube and on Substack. If you just follow at Real Savvy Joy on Substack, that's pretty much a good launching point to like all my different places to find me. I still do a fair amount of freelancing in different places, so you'll probably see me pop up more, in other publications. But yeah, those are the big ones right now. It's just really trying to. I have my drafts and editing queue are very very swollen right now, so
Yeah,
hoping to get lots of stuff out in the future.
that sounds a little too
On
familiar.
Yeah.
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 Same. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, Substack and YouTube is where folks can find me. At Real Savvy Joy on Substack is probably a good place, but yeah, either platform, Swordplay X Savvy on YouTube and Real Savvy Joy on YouTube as well.
We'll have those links down below, including the links to a few of the articles and videos that we kind of used for this, so people can kind of track on to some of the things we're talking about, get some more context on each one.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, normally I have the last word, but I would love for you to have the last word on a question that we both have had in anticipation of this interview. And if you just take a minute or two just to say, there seems to be a reversal. There seems to be people who are changing their minds on some of this stuff and waking up to the realities of these things. Um, the cynic in me says, okay, maybe. But the optimist in me, and the optimist is bigger, actually is I'm very hopeful. Are you hopeful? And give me one or two reasons why you are hopeful.
Well, I think probably the biggest reason I'm hopeful is just because you know, you know Jesus, you know the one who holds literally everything in his hands, and so having read through the Bible many times, I get to see the end where Jesus wins and all who are in him win with him.
Mhm.
I think the big thing is just that like this is true. Like that's the for me when all is said and done, reality bats last. Like
Yeah.
Jesus has the home field advantage because literally he made all, like God made all of this.
Mm.
And so there are going to continue to be people, right, deceived and being deceived, deceiving and being deceived, who are going to continue to do their shenanigans. We're, prepared for that. We're warned of that in scripture. But that reality, like I think that's why we keep seeing these waves of people who wake up. And regardless of all the different, nations plotting, people, doing their thing, the fact is like you can only outrun reality for so long, right? You can be like the airtight echo chambers don't stand a chance against when those real hard, just inescapable facts of human existence are just punching you in the face. And like I think that, on the one hand, like that's not the most optimistic note to end on, but I think the reality is that actually those are opportunities, right? I think what was it? Was it Spurgeon? And I'm gonna butcher him, but he's like, I've come to learn to love the waves that wash me onto the rock of ages. Like it's that sort of thing, right? Those moments inevitably happen. And for folks who are ready to look beyond what has been fed to us by these algorithms, by these institutions, and to really start to wrestle with these things, like they will find, just as we all have, that there is just indelible rock solid truth in the word of God. And ultimately he gets the last say. And so I think that we've been through hard things. We're going to continue to go through hard things. But I think in those moments, there's going to be more and more people who recognize, oh, wait a minute, you know, there is something very solid and timeless and true here. And as the world gets more and more false, the light of truth, it's going to get darker, but that light of truth is going to shine even brighter in that darkness because it's going to explain what's going on like nothing else does.
Mm.
And so that's, I think is really hopeful to me.
Yeah. And the church said,
Amen.
Amen.
Right. Yeah. All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the defense rests. That was fantastic. This is great.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Thanks for joining us, Sabrina.